All right, on to question 6. So question 6 asks about the role of input and output. Now, when we get to approaches, Q6 discusses each construct, but not in terms of approaches. You could hypothetically propose some, right? Such as input drives acquisition, output drives acquisition. And by drive, I mean it's the primary cause of acquisition to happen. Or you could say both input and output drive acquisition. These are all possible stances. And I'd like you to keep in mind to look at the evidence in this question because implicitly they attempt to take one of these stances. Okay. Some useful concepts for that process are the idea of necessary, sufficient, and helpful or beneficial. Okay. So if I say that something, let's use input for just the sake of argument. Input is necessary for acquisition. What I'm saying is L2 acquisition can't occur without it, right? So if I say input is necessary for acquisition, I'm saying L2 acquisition without input never occurs. Okay, that's what necessary would mean. Or I could claim that input is sufficient for L2 acquisition, which would mean that L2 acquisition can occur with input alone, right? That's what sufficient would mean in this context. And some people talk about whether something is necessary, sufficient, or both. Because I guess if it's sufficient, it's probably necessary, right? And then so then whether something's helpful or beneficial is the most obvious. It's easier in some way due to it. So if I wanted to say input is beneficial, I would say it's easier to learn with input, right? Now, if you're curious, I would say that input is necessary for acquisition. Maybe not sufficient. Certainly beneficial, but you know. So necessary and beneficial, I would say definitely for input. Anyway, so to talk about input, what's in the book, we would say that input is the major data source for the learner, ergo probably necessary. So we would say the learner constructs some kind of grammar on the basis of exemplars. And there's different perspectives about this, such as a UG perspective, a connectionism perspective. Input enhancement isn't perspective so much as a technique. And so let's talk about the UG one to start with, which again is the one that, for example, I would use the most, but it also most consistent with our understanding of grammar. So again, the assumption that we have, if we believe in UG, the assumption in the framework that uses UG is that learners start with principles in their mind, right? Like every language has a verb. That seems pretty common, right? And so then the input is used to therefore set parameters. Remember, parameters were things where we had options. Like some languages, you have to have a subject, and some languages you don't. And so then I might assume that, you know, that I always have verbs, but whether the subject needs to be explicit or not, whether it can be null, might be parametrically set. And I would use input, so listening to the language or seeing the language or I guess reading the language to figure that out. In addition, you would need input to acquire lexical items because the lexical items themselves don't exist in UG, and that includes the morphemes, the phonology goes along with them, and so on and so forth. If we look into from a connectionism point of view, connectionism is an approach that believes in the central necessity of input in the sense it's about frequency, really. And in fact, connectionism would say you can learn from pure input, which is a claim that input is not only necessary but sufficient. So a learner is in this model some kind of computer that processes and tallies linguistic information. You require a really large data set and that should be enough. Okay, so in connectionism, input is not only necessary but sufficient. Input enhancement, as I said, isn't a particular framework. It's just a technique. And the reason why it comes up here is because if you think input is important, maybe you want to use input enhancement to capitalize on that fact. So it's a strategy for making use of it, like drawing attention to it using things like underline, bold colors. So if it's visual, right? If you are signing it, I don't know the exact ways that you put emphasis, but I can only imagine that there's stuff in posture that can put emphasis. Certainly in speech, you can say stuff louder if you really wanted to, or pause dramatically. Oh, that probably happens in signing too. Dramatic pauses. I could think. I don't know. Anyway, you take what's in the input and you make it more salient in some way. You draw attention to it in some way. And these examples are the classic ones because input enhancement is usually referring to the written modality, but again, it doesn't have to be. Here's an example you learn the past tense in English we talked about. So if I wanted you to pay attention to the ED on John walked, I could turn it red, I could bold it, I could underline it. And any of those hypothetically would draw more attention to the written form. Output. Output sometimes is also called performance. When we say performance, we are drawing attention to the fact that it might not reflect what's in our mind, but output is sort of neutral to that particular question. So under output, the first and most famous theory, don't let the word hypothesis trick you, it's theory. Theory is the comprehensible output hypothesis by Merrill Swain. Then we also have the interaction hypothesis, which as you can see here has a broader base of people who studied it. And then skill acquisition theory. The second two here appear in the theory section of our book, so you can skip ahead to that if you wanted to glance at them in more detail. However, the comprehensible output hypothesis is like this. Output is necessary as a mechanism of acquisition. Now, you should immediately be like comparing this to the other things we said about input. So if I said that if I'm a UGer and I say input is necessary, but not sufficient necessarily, necessary for L2 acquisition, it could happen with this, right? So if I think input's necessary and output's necessary, I could say that's okay. Whereas connectionism, we said input was sufficient, which would be completely in contrast to this, right? So that's why necessary and sufficient versus beneficial, which is comparatively very vague, are useful because it can tell you what's compatible and what's not. So the reason why Swain claimed that the output would be necessary is that it's needed to test hypotheses about the language. So it's not until you attempt to sign it or attempt to say it or attempt to write it or whatever that you discover that you have failed to communicate and you go, huh, maybe I should do that differently, right? So in particular, her quote from 1985 was that it would move the learner from pure semantic analyses to also syntactic analyses, okay? There are modern reincarnations by her that are weaker. That is, output may help acquisition. So it's clearly after her 1985 papers, I think it's just one, but I'm not sure. She took a step back and went, actually, it's not necessary, but it's beneficial, okay? Again, necessary, sufficient, beneficial are important concepts for understanding this. Now, the interaction hypothesis, and as I said, this is one of the ones that's in the back of the book in the theory section, would say that output is necessary as well as a vehicle of interaction, right? And interaction is what it sounds like. It's me using the language and you using the language back, and we have some kind of interaction. We have some kind of exchange, right? So what that means is that output is necessary and input is necessary in this version, right? Again, compatible, at least to this point, with UG. It could be compatible potentially with connectionism if, output is necessary. Although, no, it wouldn't work because input would be sufficient if it's connectionism, right? So this is compatible with UG, but not with connectionism. So interaction. So output is necessary as a vehicle of interaction. It also provides them feedback, other negative evidence. And so there's this concept that's sort of under the hood here that's worth pointing out. It's called like a communication breakdown. And there's sort of an example of it in the book about a vase. The person says basin, and they're trying to say vase. If you read it, it's in the last section of these pages. But a communication breakdown is when I'm trying to express a thought to you in whatever modality, and you're like, do not understand, right? And so you have to exchange more and evaluate and negotiate until either you stop trying or you are understood. And the interaction hypothesis says that this is extremely important, right? And you wouldn't get it without output, okay? Skill acquisition theory, again, in the theory section, it's defined skill as an ability to do, okay? So keep in mind that this particular theory does not assume a mental grammar, right? So your ability, or it doesn't have to at the very least, or rather your performance is not driven by your mental grammar so much as a skill that you've acquired. And so therefore, if we wanted to learn how to do output, we would have to practice it as a skill. And in particular, this theory would argue perhaps you'd have explicit instruction first. It's unclear to me what the role of input is in this particular theory, right? Or rather, the fine grain. Clearly, I think they would say input is beneficial, but as to whether it is necessary, it's not entirely clear from this formulation. But the idea is simply that you practice, you know, signing, speaking, writing, whatever, in order to sign, speak, write, whatever better is the idea. And an input-driven model would be in conflict with this. Okay, so Van Patten-Bonatti's assessment of the data is the following. It's uncontroversial that input is crucial. Second, I thought I wrote controversial twice. It's uncontroversial that input is crucial. So the ones that do not put a large role for input or don't at least allow for it are in a little bit of trouble, right? The role of output is debated. There's tons and tons of theories that would say that, output's helpful, but it's certainly not sufficient, and its necessity is debatable. If you look back at the crash and stuff we talked about, output had no role in there whatsoever. Crashing could just as easily been in the input section here because it's extremely important to monitor theory as well. The quote, or rather the piece of the book that I'm making reference here is in page 42. In particular, the reason why the authors draw a question about whether output is useful is that there's a resistance to correction, right? And I think, yeah, so we talked about feedback briefly earlier, but when I produce language in some sense, let's imagine I'm speaking English and I make an error and you try to fix it. It's possible that I will not notice that you tried to fix it. It's very possible. Or I do notice it and I fix it wrong. And so the authors would say that this resistance or just sort of avoidance, or however you want to frame it, depending on the exact examples, to correction is so common, they would infer the output is unlikely to be necessary because, it's not all these like I'm hypothesis testing and he will give me feedback and isn't necessarily happening, right? Again, I would refer you back to the noticing hypothesis again. So maybe there's a role of awareness that could happen with output, but I'll be tentative on that. It depends. It depends a lot. So anyway, this is the argument from the authors that this resistance to correction that we see in L2 learners, they would say that it's unlikely to, it makes output unlikely to be necessary. Okay. On the flip side, so there's a subgenre of SLA called instructed SLA or ISLA. It's actually a heritage version called HSLA. But instructed and heritage instructed SLA are about looking at kind of manipulating classroom factors and seeing the effect on output. It's usually sort of a treatment framework where I do a pre-test, I do some kind of intervention, like I teach you something in 6 different ways or something, and then I do a post-test and I see if you've improved. And a lot of ISLA papers would suggest that output is helpful. At the very least, it's helpful. To decide whether it's necessary or not, it takes a little bit more doing than that. But I can tell you it's helpful according to the research. Okay. Yeah. So here, often the input plus output groups outperform the input-only groups in those studies. Okay. And so here's a little pro tip. So I've kind of been helping you as we go, and this is also here in case you were like flipping through the slides and not listening to me talk. Go through the theories that we talked about and others, but specifically these, and decide whether for each input and output are necessary, sufficient, or helpful or beneficial, right? Because if you can do that with or without my narration, you understand this question. Okay, so that's what you should be doing. Great, here are the works cited, and see you in